Hello, everyone, and welcome to what will probably be a pretty short review video on um, moral relativism versus moral objectivism. Um, so there are these, we start with, there are these two different things. These are up to opposing ideas, moral relativism versus objectivism. Um, we'll get into the details first, but we kind of start with a variety of moral relativism, which is cultural relativism. And that kind of starts with the observation that there are different cultures have different moral codes regarding certain things like burial practices, for example. So the Greeks would bury or cremate the dead, I believe, and the Galatians would eat the dead. Upon hearing what the other culture does, both are, equally kind of appalled. They're like, what? How disrespectful. I mean, and it's common in the US to either cremate or bury the dead. And what a lot of you hear when you hear like eating the dead, your first thought might be, oh my God, that's awful. That's so disrespectful. Um, how could you do that? But then you realize the Galatians, for example, is one example of a culture that would eat the dead. They think the same thing about the Greeks. They're like, oh my God, how disrespectful of you to bury them. Um, so that, and when you consider that, you might be your gut reaction if you want to be, understanding of other cultures and you don't want to be arrogant. You're like, actually, why would I think that my culture's the right one? I mean, shouldn't it be the case that we're both right? I don't want to say they're wrong because they don't do what I do. I mean, how ignorant would that be, right? So also, this pretty simple observation, there are two kinds of statements. There are objective statements, such as the Earth orbits the sun. These are like facts. And there are relative statements, like cats are better than dogs, or Jurassic Park is better than Jurassic World, the movie. And, I might be like, I'm a fan of cats. I might be like, I don't see how anyone could prefer dogs to cats. However, I mean, to other than just being annoying about it, you still are like, yeah, I mean, that's a relative state. It's true for me that cats are better than dogs, and it, that's probably false for a lot of other people. And moral relativism is just the idea that moral statements are like the latter. Moral statements are only relatively true or false. So the most common version is cultural relativism. Um, this one also seems the most intuitive, and if you're a relativist, this is the route that most people take. So it's a specific version of relativism. Cultural relativism is the belief that moral statements are true or false only relative to a given culture's beliefs and practices. So true for there are plenty of cultures where it's true for them, false for another culture. So it's wrong to eat the dead. True for Greeks, false for Galatians. So it's wrong to eat the dead and it's not wrong to eat the dead are two contradictory statements. Nevertheless, they can exist in the same universe depending on the culture. Infanticide is wrong. We talked about how most Americans will probably agree infanticide is always wrong. But this is false for some Inuit cultures. Some Inuit cultures have been documented to leave a child in the snow to um, preserve the lives of their other children and the well-being of their family. Certain medical procedures are wrong. I don't know exactly the details, I believe, or maybe you could think of like blood transfers. I believe, and I could be wrong about this, but I believe Jehovah's Witnesses, so they're kind of known for refusing a lot of medical treatments, such as I believe blood transfusions. So certain medical procedures are wrong. True for Jehovah's Witnesses, false for atheists, also probably false for a lot more people. Um, Maybe Jehovah's Witnesses and Amish people too, other religions and sects of even American culture, subcultures within American culture, are in the minority, but still they're not wrong. They're right according to their culture. So the cultural differences argument, this is you guys have this in your notes, of course. The premises are there are cultural differences regarding every moral statement. Think about like infanticide is wrong. true for most Americans, false for some Inuit cultures. There are no cultural differences regarding any objectively true or false statement. So you can kind of think of this, you can phrase this in a few ways. Another way to phrase it might be, uh, if if something is an objectively true or false statement, there wouldn't be any cultural differences about it. I mean, there wouldn't be disagreement if it were objective. Um, we'll come back to this premise, but that's another way to think of it. So just kind of like if something's objective, then there aren't cultural differences about it. And when we think just about like the moral cases, like we remember the case of eating the dead and the case of infanticide, I mean, that seems pretty plausible. Like, yeah, if it were objective that infanticide is wrong, then there wouldn't be like cultures that do infanticide. So that's one example. And the conclusion is therefore no moral statement is objectively true. So this is a cultural differences argument, and it seems kind of appealing, honestly, for a lot of people who want to adopt a certain kind of humility about their own culture. So this is a way of explaining that um, morality isn't objective, it's relative. However, we discussed a couple issues with this argument. Um, the first one is there's kind of a pretty obvious seeming counterexample to the second premise. So there are cultures in some societies, there were many more, but there still are to this day, cultures that fully believe the earth is flat. Um, however, that it doesn't follow that the earth is flat for them. In fact, they're just wrong. It is objectively true that the earth is a sphere, and there are cultural differences regarding that statement. So you see how this is a counterexample. So there's something that we have that's objectively true or false. This is the Earth is a sphere is an objectively true statement. At least I'm pretty sure there might be flat earthers here. I don't mean to disrespect you. So that's something that is objectively true. However, there are cultural differences regarding it. So that's one counterexample here, and it's that might be the reason that some people have had a hard time grasping this premise because you're probably anticipating this certain counterexample coming up. But so yeah, that's one possibility. And maybe you think that you can amend the cultural differences argument to make it a bit stronger than this. We don't go over a revised version, so that's not necessarily important for you to know for this class. So there might be another objection at play here, and that's an objection to the first premise. Um, so that is that are they really so different? I mean, the premise is there are cultural differences regarding every moral statement. So if you can find at least one at least one moral statement where there are no cultural differences, then you've come up with a counterexample to this premise. And one might actually be that the seemingly shared moral value that all children are morally valuable. So the belief that infanticide isn't always wrong, held by some Inuit cultures, and the contradictory belief held by most American cultures that infanticide is always wrong. Um, yeah, those are contradictory beliefs about a moral statement, but that's about a specific action, and really there's a universal principle underlying it. And it's maybe universal, at least shared by many cultures, and that is that all children are morally valuable. So the Inuits believe that infanticide isn't always wrong because they believe all children are morally valuable and they face these very harsh life or death scenarios where they need to commit infanticide in order to preserve the life of the rest of their children. Um, but Americans don't face those same dilemmas, so they come up with a different result. However, their underlying moral value is the same. All children are morally valuable. And then what we did with the lifeboat scenario is if you put many Americans under um, the same life or death conditions, you're actually going to get a belief that's more similar to the Inuit culture. That is, it isn't always wrong to maybe kill a family member in order to preserve the life of the rest of your family members. There's also something, I don't have it written out on here, but about that you can kind of press on relativism with. So these are already two objections. You might be sold at this point. Um, and one thing that might further take away from relativism's appeal is the idea that relativism actually ends up saying that you can't really, soundly critique your own culture. So, for example, we want to say that, when people said during the Jim Crow era that our practices of segregation and Jim Crow laws are wrong, that they were saying something true. And relativism would have to say, actually, no, they couldn't be wrong because it was relative and it's, this culture, most people believed it was right and they're following what their ancestors did. So actually, um, Jim Crow laws weren't wrong. But a lot of people want to object to that. So they might be like, no, we want to say that when civil rights activists, said this is wrong, that they were correct and they were saying something true. Um, and then social progress, you kind of lose the meaning of social progress. If you were always right, um, then what is progress really? We kind of want to say that there's a moral improvement from the Jim Crow era to the post-civil rights era in American culture. And it wasn't that, we were all equally as moral the whole time, that we're morally better now for not doing that, and that we were wrong before. So relativism, some people might adopt it, be inclined towards it to be humble about their own culture. They end up accidentally saying that their own culture can actually never be wrong. And that's not really something that a lot of people want to say. Um, so actually, you find that moral objectivism is maybe more conducive to critiquing one's own culture and being humble about one's own culture. And if we have some moral objectivism, as a reminder, is like the opposite of moral relativism in a way. Some moral statements are objectively true or false. So we want to say if, insofar as any culture practices racism, um, racism is still wrong. And they're wrong for being racist. Um, and that seems pretty obvious. Um, so in order to kind of take part in that kind of social critique, you realize that, you could say it's actually better to say that it's objectively true that, for example, racism is wrong. That's an objective moral fact. Um, so that might be why some people, after observing cultural relativism, are inclined actually towards um, moral objectivism. However, moral objectivism, there's still a remaining question. If, certain actions are objective or certain statements, moral statements are objectively true or false, how do we determine which ones are true and which ones are false? And there are different ways to do that. So the two main ones we discuss are utilitarianism, which is a version of consequentialism, and Kantianism. More elaboration on those in the trolley problem video that I posted. But those are two moral objectivist stances, and they're both ways of saying there's an objective right and wrong, and it's determined through this way, through what has the best net consequences, or through what respects others' humanity with Kantianism, for example. So just that to consider. And yeah, that's the gist of the relativism, the version that you guys have to know. Um, Still continue to think about even things that I didn't explicitly cover. These videos aren't comprehensive, so keep that in mind. But yeah, thank you for watching.